Okay, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Ronald Hutton as the Oxford O'Donnell Lecturer in Celtic Studies for 2025. Professor Hutton is currently a Professor of History at the University of Bristol. He specialises in the history of Ireland and Britain in the 16th and 17th centuries, on ancient and medieval paganism and magic, and on the global context of witchcraft beliefs. He's the author of some 19 books, some of the most recent of which include The Witch, A History of Fear from Ancient Times to the Present, and Pagan Britain, both published with Yale University Press, and also A Brief History of Britain, 1485 to 1660. He was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2013. He's currently working on a book about pagan goddesses in different European and Near Eastern cultures associated with love and war. And his talk today derives from that work, looking at the Irish representative of this type, the Morrigan. In his talk today, the Morrigan Revisited. Welcome.
As I've been accorded the considerable honour of the O'Donnell Lectures, I should do honour to them in turn by serving in some measure their remit to illuminate the relationship between Celtic and Anglophone cultures and peoples. I intend to do so more in the spirit than in the letter, by extending the brief to encompass a comparative exercise between Irish mythology and those of a number of different cultures. Nevertheless, the impact of the Morrigan on the modern Anglophone world is considerable. Forgive me, I am pressing the button and it's not working, so I'll press this and it's not working.
It is not working.
Take it out so I can see the things on the side.
Well, it's okay now. It went to sleep.
Ladies and gentlemen, in my first few minutes I've succeeded in putting the system to sleep. Heaven knows what I'm doing to you. What's undeniable is the Morrigan is the best known of all the goddess figures in medieval Irish literature, next to Bridget. Indeed, she often functions as a dark alter ego to Bridget, standing for all the things that Bridget does not. Violence, sex, shape-shifting, and sorcery, all the dark S's, are at the top of the list. She has more interest in her now than she's enjoyed for at least 1,500 years, having gained a truly international following. Since the 1960s, she has earned a notable presence as a villainess in children's literature, above all in that of Alan Garner's Alderley Edge novels and Pat O'Shea's Hounds of the Morrigan. She's also found her way into the pop music industry, as Madonna's video for her hit single Frozen in the 1990s strongly featured her imagery. Like Madonna, she has become an iconic contemporary figure with a large fan club, especially in America. Unlike Madonna, many of her devotees now actually worship her, or at least work with her as a powerful spiritual being. She represents the scary side of feminine power. This has an especial resonance in an age which seeks to redeem all aspects of humanity and explore its limits. The present lecture is designed to go back to her Irish roots in quest of her, with those promised comparative glances abroad to explain her modern prominence. To make it as accessible as possible to an Anglophone audience, I'm going to anglicise the titles of the Irish texts discussed in it in my speech, while retaining the Irish titles in my slides. I might say my pronunciation might be a bit off at times. I know the rules of pronunciation for Old and Middle Irish in theory, but some of these terms I have never actually heard pronounced by a living being, so I am making an approximation based on the rules. I've already started that process of anglicisation by calling the lady herself the Morrigan, and not the Morrigan as she was in medieval Irish. A quest for her, like so many quests for historical origins, reveals a more complicated story than may at first have been expected. This may be indicated by the lack of consensus among experts concerning her identity. A result not only of different interpretative frameworks, but of differing representations in the sources. John Carey saw her as but one aspect of a unitary Irish war goddess with many names, both nourisher and destroyer. To Rosalind Clark, followed by Miranda Aldhouse Green, she was at once a representative of war, fertility, and sovereignty. To Moya Herbert, she was more a tutelary deity, with an especial emphasis on prophecy. Diety O'Hogan made her represent soil and its irrigation, as partner of an ancestral sun god, the Dachta. Angelique Guilhermovich Epstein reasserted her role as a war goddess, representing armed conflict in all its complex guises. All these views were expressed in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, and there seems to have been no significant scholarly work since. Perhaps this was because the aforementioned authors had covered pretty well all the possible options between them. An attempt will now be made here to explain the disagreement, and also to propose a way of understanding the sources further. It rests upon the following proposition. The medieval authors have often been treated as Christians who, when writing about the pagan past, were rummaging among the ruins of a collapsed structure of belief. I would propose instead that they were Christians who were rummaging among the building blocks of a structure which had not yet actually been constructed. In other words, they were not operating with vestiges of a coherent mythology and pantheon of deities, but with diverse traditions which had not been given the time or opportunity to become either. In cases where historians have been able to trace the formation of a coherent pagan mythology, as in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the following process has been observed. It begins with a variety of unrelated and strongly localized groups of deities, honored by different communities, cities, or tribes. Once these communities had been unified into centralized kingdoms, the work began of assimilating their deities into a framework suitable for a large state and which legitimized its rulers. This meant fitting the various local deities into families, hierarchies, and relationships, with particular roles and common stories. It was a process continued for thousands of years. Pagan Ireland never achieved such a political unification, having an extreme pattern of decentralization into 600 or 700 kingdoms. As such, it is best not to compare it with the huge imperial monarchies of the ancient Near East, but with Greece, which was divided into a large number of independent city-states. Nevertheless, the Greeks did develop a strong sense of distinctive and shared cultural identity with a common set of deities. The construction of one was carried out by oral storytellers and then literate poets and playwrights. It was never complete or entirely coherent. When the Roman intellectual Cicero wrote his book on deities, he made one speaker conclude that there must be at least 5 different gods called Dionysus. They were too unalike to make up a single figure. This diversity was certainly much more apparent at the level of cult than of literature, which had a vested interest in harmony to achieve wide circulation. Nevertheless, Greek writers never managed to agree entirely upon the family relationships and natures of their divine beings. In many ways, these disparities are part of a wider feature of literature before the invention of printing tended to fix and canonize traditions of fiction. Both ancient and medieval writers regularly accorded legendary characters, relationships, backgrounds, personalities, or names that were different from those of other authors. In the Arthurian legend, the constantly changing nature and relationships of Morgan Le Fay, or the wide variety of names given to the treacherous female pupil of Merlin, are obvious examples. Medieval Irish mythology, however, took this disparity to an extreme degree. This suggests that by the time of Christianization, the work of rationalization of different sets of divinities had hardly begun. The subsequent medieval writers attempted to undertake it at times, as medieval Ireland, like ancient Greece, developed a powerful sense of common cultural identity that overlay political decentralization. The result, however, I would argue, was never a coherent national mythology, but a confused medley of characters and stories on which different medieval writers drew in different ways for different purposes. Let me suggest how this might have operated in the case of the Morrigan. It is generally acknowledged that she featured in the text within an inner and outer penumbra of associations with other beings. The outer one consisted of generalized spirits of battle, and the inner one of named goddesses associated with war. The battle spirits were generic, not individual, and were expected to swarm around major clashes of armies, anticipating, encouraging, and then enjoying the slaughter. They could also accompany notable heroes to fights. There was a fairly standard repertoire of them, although we are not really sure what it meant. They comprised Uatha and Ardrecha, usually translated vaguely as spectres; Banana, which could mean pale spirits; Berkana, which may have had something to do with goats or something to do with bogs; Gelcha Glinya, or Gienacha Glinya, wild female entities from glens; and Jevna Iora, demons of the air. Kristen Mills has argued convincingly that as both the words for demons of the air were taken from Latin, and that the air was the home element for Christian demons, these war spirits, at least, were importations from mainstream Christian demonology. Nevertheless, other Christian cultures did not give demons that constant association with battle. Moreover, all of these beings seem airborne in most appearances. They swarm like birds or mosquitoes. Occasionally an author would depict some of them as having solid bodies and living on the earth, but always on their home patches, away from the field of conflict. There may be a feature of natural history behind this tradition, that carrion birds, used to the bounty of a battlefield, would recognise war bands on the move as harbingers of a feast. They could well have flown above these bands in the hope of bounty. Nevertheless, while ancient and medieval literature across Europe associated scavenging animals with battlefields, none had war spirits of the Irish kind. The latter neither carry off the souls of the dead, like Norse Valkyries, nor go on individual missions, like Roman Furies, nor actually eat the dead, like animals. To them, battle is a spectator sport, without apparent team loyalties. The point here is that in many respects, Irish war goddesses are the generic Irish war spirits, writ large. So we come to these goddesses and the mythological tangle that they represent. Strictly speaking, there are 43 of them mentioned in the texts. 37 of these, however, occur in just 2 such texts, the destruction of Dardega's hostel and the cattle raid of Regavan. They are used there as alternative labels for 2 of the better known goddesses, and may have been the invention of the authors or of their communities. When they are discounted, we have one goddess, Thea, who is only a name, and 5 who feature as personalities: Benaid, Macha, the Nevin, Badav, and the Morrigan herself. The medieval authors believed that they formed some kind of group, but had no common idea of what kind of group that was. 3 major literary enterprises in particular attempted to synthesize inherited mythology: the Book of Invasions, the Place Name Law, or Din Henachas, and the Law of Famous Women, or Ban Henachas. In these texts, the 5 characters are shuffled like cards in a deck, or rearranged like markings in a kaleidoscope. They are formed into duos, or trios, and given siblings of both sexes, and parents, and husbands. But the nature of all these relationships alters not only from text to text, or even from one variant of a text to another, but sometimes within the same version of the same text. Further variations are found in other kinds of literature. Sometimes the characters concerned are identified with each other, or individually with other goddesses who are usually outside the group, like Anu or Anan and Danan. There is no coherent mythology here, therefore, but a set of names with associations attached, who are arranged in different ways by different authors or local traditions. Nevertheless, the associations that are attached to these 5 goddesses are very strong and largely uniform. They are personally terrifying and connected to war, which they encourage and enjoy exactly as the collective groups of battlefield spirits do. Like those spirits, they have no interest in dead warriors, either as food or as heroic souls to be carried to an afterlife. Like them also, they never fight physically themselves. In the texts about the 2 battles of Moytura, however, they do deploy magic to defend their own people. That people is the main grouping of Irish gods to Arthur Day, among whom they are numbered in those tales and in the Book of Invasions. The first battle of Moytura makes the Badav, Macha, and the Morrigan the three sorceresses of the deities. They use magic, literally druidcraft, to rain fire and blood and raise mists in order to spread confusion among the enemy. In the Second Battle of Moytira, the Morrigan kills the opposing king by draining him of blood and strength, again apparently by sorcery. This answers to another remarkable feature of Irish myth, which is not found in Norse, German, Greek or Roman culture, but is present in a very similar form in ancient Egypt. It is the concept of magic as a neutral power embedded in the cosmos. As such, it is employed by the deities routinely as part of their superior abilities and wisdom, but may also be as legitimately employed by humans who are clever enough, druid enough, to know how to do so. This legitimacy extended in both Ireland and Egypt to the use of destructive magic without much inhibition. That is why both cultures were unusual in the ancient and historic worlds, Ireland and Egypt, as having no concept of the witch as a dangerous, antisocial figure within human society. I am not, of course, suggesting that the one influenced the other, much though that would have delighted the authors of the Book of Invasions, who made Egypt one of the origin points for the Irish. The similarities seem the result of parallel evolution. Despite their interrelation, there are also some distinct differences between the big five Irish war goddesses. It is time to start working through those with the intention of determining what made the Morrigans stand out among them. Bainade can be disposed of swiftly. Though she is well cited, she is barely a personality at all. In fact, she's really an add-on. Her name means wife of Nade, and that's what she is, consort, or one of the consorts, of the war god Nade. The couple share no actual stories, save that they built a fortress together as a home. Nade is no more of a character than his wife, save for once being called surly. He seems to have been viewed as an unpopular curmudgeon, like the Greek Ares. Together they are summed up as venomous in one glossary. There's a chance, indeed, that Bainade was not a name, but a title, for another of the big five, the Nevin, who was also married to Nade. One glossary, that of Cormac, certainly thought so. But the medieval Irish epic par excellence, the cattle raid of Cooley, was clear that they were separate beings. The cattle raid of Cooley, indeed, made the Nevin one of four leading war goddesses, with Bainade, the Badhav, and the Morrigan, and gave her an active role. This consisted not of appearing at actual battles, but of disrupting the camp of a particular army, destined to be the losers, on 3 successive nights. Her attacks consist of raising shrieks that throw the warriors into confusion and cause 100 to die of fright each time. In her third attack, she is joined by the Badhav and Bainade in screaming above the camp and producing a similar body count. This facility to provoke panic seems to be her main defining characteristic. One of the metrical Din Henachas calls her Nevin of the anguish cry. As said, the first battle of Moytira made the Badhav, Macha, and the Morrigan the grand trio of war goddesses and sorceresses, as did some recensions of the Book of Invasions, so Macha can be considered next. Her identity in the literature seems to spring from a need to explain the name of the main legendary royal centre of Ulster, Evan Macha. Medieval writers thought that this either meant the twins or the brooch of Maha, which is a female name. Storytellers therefore had to come up with something to explain both or either, and they did, with two completely different origin tales. One was of a superhuman woman called Maha, without a backstory, who inexplicably marries a dim-witted Ulsterman. She then gives birth to twins in traumatic circumstances, after being mistreated by the King of Ulster horribly, and dies or departs according to the version. So, twins. The other is of a ruthless human warrior queen, red-haired Maha, who traces the boundary of the royal residence with her brooch pin, so we got the pin in there. She is married to the king and subsequently rules Ulster alone when he dies, until she is eventually killed. A third and yet different Maha, and a rather surprising one, crops up in the Book of Invasions and the Din Henachas as Maha the Gentle, wife of the ruler of a race of beings who preceded the Tuatha Dé in occupying Ireland. She dies of distress after a bad dream, thereby making her the divine wimp of medieval Irish mythology, the opposite pole from red-haired Maha. How any of these relate to Maha the war goddess, one of the later Tuatha Dé, is anybody's guess. That goddess, the war goddess of the Tuatha Dé, is really just a name in a list. She's given a divine lineage, but only because she's made a sister of other war goddesses who have actual stories. The Second Battle of Moytira makes her die in the battle before human beings reach Ireland. A gloss on a text states that severed heads of warriors were known as Macha's pig fodder. This chilling observation could, however, refer equally to red-haired Macha, the warrior queen. There is a suspicion that the human queen and the war goddess are somehow connected, and that one lies behind the other, but it remains unconfirmed. One solution to this problem employed by some scholars has been to cut through the whole tangle by declaring that it all must refer to one being, who was the tutelary goddess of Ulster. This is, however, no more than a speculation, imposed upon the evidence rather than based upon it. So we come to the Badav, who has already been much mentioned, and here there is a different sort of tangle, created of singulars, plurals, and articles. In one context, a Badav was simply one of a particular kind of battle spirit, the Badava, regularly entered in the roll call of the spectral horrors gathering to enjoy a fray. They had a specific identity, however, because a Badav was also the name for a real species of bird, the grey-black hooded crow. It is the most common kind of scavenging bird in Ireland, the equivalent to the British carrion crow. Badava were therefore crow spirits, a very suitable kind to attend battlefields. The identification is closer in that they're regularly represented as flying over things, crying out, and having red mouths, all traits of the hooded crow. They do more things, however, that other battlefield spirits do not. A Badav, in the singular, is often described as passing over an army and predicting its doom. In this setting, therefore, the Badav may be regarded, the Badav, may be regarded as a super Badav, the divine queen of the group. She was, as has been seen, treated as a major war goddess, and she has constant interaction with humans in the stories. Really, she does three things here. She prophesy slaughters, she incites slaughters, and she enjoys slaughters. Storytellers imagined her in different guises. Most unsurprisingly, made her a hideous hag. The author of The Courtship of Phaeb, on the other hand, made her a divinely beautiful, pale-skinned blonde, in royal apparel. Her mission, however, is still to make trouble by appearing in dreams to people in neighbouring kingdoms, to stir up war between them, in which a lot of them are going to die. A crucial question is whether the Badhav does anything else, such as engaging in amorous trysts, or encouraging and inspiring heroes, as well as dispiriting them. One writer inevitably married her off to Nade, but usually a sexualized Badhav relies on one story. This is the famous destruction of Dardega's hostel, where an otherworldly woman turns up at the residence of a doomed king. Her mission is, of course, to seal his fate. She provides a long list of names for herself, two of which are Badhav and Nevan. At one point, he asks her what she wants, reasonably enough, and she replies that she wants whatever pleases him. This could be taken as sexual innuendo, but it's deeply ambiguous. The woman is described as having bony blackened legs, a mouth on the side of her face, and pubic hair hanging to her knees. Now, I may be old-fashioned or unimaginative, but I don't view all this as a turn-on. If her reply includes an invitation to sex at all, then its import is surely mocking. The episode which might show her as assisting a hero is likewise taken from only one text. This is among the boyhood deeds of the supreme Ulster hero, Cuchulainn, in the cattle raid of Cooley. One of them is to fight the reanimated corpse of a warrior encountered on a recent battlefield. Initially, the zombie gets the better of him. Cuchulainn then, however, hears the Badhav speak from among the nearby corpses, mocking him for being defeated. This gives him the fury, the warp spasm, needed to fight back and win. Again, however, the import is ambiguous. She could have been doing this to stir him up, or she could genuinely have thought him finished. When these two references are removed, then the Badhav purely features as a predator on and an instigator of violence. She has no redeeming features, except possibly as an early warning system of a disaster you still can't escape. She has no human devotees. So we come at last to the star of the show, the Morrigan herself. Our mission now is to determine what it was about her that makes her stand out in this literature and explains her modern Anglophone fame and band of devotees, while her sister goddesses remain known only to specialists. The first point to resolve here is whether she was indeed a distinct character, or interchangeable with other goddesses of her kind. Certainly, some medieval authors blended her with the rest. One version of the cattle raid of Rigavan calls the goddess in it the Morrigan, and another calls her the Badhav. So it could be that in this story they're regarded as the same. On the other hand, it could simply be that different storytellers referred to different goddesses. The Morrigan also commonly features in lists partnered with the Badhav, Macha, etc. as one of a kind. More generally, goddesses of this sort were commonly referred to as Moriu or Morinya, the Morrigans. She was clearly therefore one of a genre, even though her definite article might indicate that she stood out in it. Certainly, for a lot of the time, she behaves in the text like all the others, predicting or inciting military mayhem, and then enjoying it. However, she is different from the others in three important ways. The first is that she does not merely prophesy battles, but greater things as well. At the close of the Second Battle of Moytura, she predicts both the golden age which is to follow the victory and the eventual decline and end of the world. That gives her the status of a cosmic seeress, an Irish equivalent to the Lady of the Norse of Völuspá. Her second and third distinguishing characteristics are that she has a distinctly amorous aspect to her, and that she promises assistance in victory to particular heroes. The two traits are associated, and as such are pivotal to two very famous stories. The first is the Second Battle of Moytura, in which she meets and makes love with one of the leaders of the Tuatha Dé, the Dachda. In return, she brings about the death of the king of his enemies, and so helps ensure him and their people's success in their war with them. The Din Henachas actually has the Morrigan and the Dachda marry each other and set up home in the bend of the River Boyne. Their union was embedded in names for natural features in the region. One place was known as her garden, and a proverb awarded her a cooking hearth. At times, she looks almost domestic, the Morrigan at home. She even had a son, though admittedly he did have 3 lethal serpents inside him. The other text shows her as lover and giver of victory is the cattle raid of Cooley, where she accosts Cuchulainn in the guise of a beautiful royal woman and offers him help in war in exchange for sex. He refuses rudely something Cuchulainn is good at, whereupon she tries in revenge to get him killed by hampering him in combat in the shape of an eel, a she-wolf, and a heifer. He beats her off and wounds her each time, and then she tricks him into curing each of her wounds with a blessing. This famous episode may have been a parody of the account of the way in which the goddess Athena aided Greek heroes in Homer's Iliad, which might have been known to the author in Latin translation. In that case, it could function as a Christian alternative of how a proper hero should treat a pagan goddess. On the other hand, it could just be a way in which some authors think that a true hero should behave generally. There is an exact parallel to this story in a text which its composer could not possibly have read, the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, which was written about 1800 BCE, in that the eponymous hero is propositioned by the goddess Ishtar. She promises him earthly success in exchange for sex, and is also contemptuously rejected. In revenge, she sends a monster after him, which he has to kill. A transcultural motif, therefore, not universal but sporadic, is that a superhero must go it alone. This episode was moreover not canonical. The tale of the Morrigan's attempt to get Cuchulainn killed by distracting him successively in 3 different animal guises was widely known, but 2 other texts provided a different motive for her doing so. These were the cattle raid of Regatham and the adventures of Nera. In them she takes against him because he rudely tries to prevent her from crossing his land with a cow of hers. The 2 versions are not compatible, a reminder that the stories about Cuchulainn may have been part of a cycle, but are not a single composite epic. This has bearing on the final one that features the Morrigan, the death of Cuchulainn. In it, she attempts to save his life by wrecking his chariot overnight, and so preventing him from going on his fatal mission. All versions have this. But there is more difficulty with the common modern impression that the Morrigan flies onto his shoulder at the moment of death in the shape of a bird. This scene, so iconic in modern Irish culture, its sculpture stands in the modern Irish nationalist shrine, the Post Office at Dublin, is represented differently in different versions of the story. One, which seems fairly clearly to be the earliest, simply has a hooded crow do so. A different and much later version makes this bird a human sorceress in disguise, who has confusingly the name of Baddav. Later still, she becomes identified with the Morrigan. The point here is that the instability and creativity of the tradition should warn us against trying to unify it. If the Morrigan is a friend to Cuchulainn later in his career, but an enemy earlier in it, it is unlikely to be because she's forgiven him in the interim. It is more probably because we are dealing with different storytellers with different takes on the relationship. There is equal lack of unanimity on her physical characteristics. As with the Baddav, storytellers visualised her as they chose. Some made her a withered crone, others a beauty, others demonic, and yet others a stately red-haired lady. Writers could not even agree on how to spell her name, which means they couldn't agree on its import. With an accent on the O, she becomes the Great Queen, and without one is probably the Nightmare Queen. Neither quite fits, because she was not regarded as the greatest of Irish goddesses, and her nature in the stories was, as is being explained, not wholly nightmarish. Linguistic evidence strongly suggests that the latter meaning, the possible Nightmare Queen, not the Great Queen, is the original one. Her role as a benevolent patroness of particular peoples and groups is quite widespread in the literature, even though it's not pervasive. One of the Ban Henachas calls her Morrigu who brings victory. One of the Din Henachas recounts how she answered the prayer of a druid to help him win the hand of a fair maiden. It is time to draw conclusions together by asking if all these aspects of her add up to a consistent portrait of a goddess, and if so, of what kind. There are some interpretations of her that should probably be discarded now. She is not a convincing fertility or earth deity. She does not give lands or people abundance, or increase the fecundity of crops, livestock, or marriages. Her interest in cattle, which features in some tales, is as wealth or triggers for war. Overwhelmingly, she doesn't breed them, she steals them. She is not a convincing tutelary goddess either. She is not associated with the protection or well-being of particular provinces, kingdoms, or peoples. Nor does she match up well to a sovereignty goddess. She does not bestow kingship or rulership on anybody, but helps some people to achieve success in war or in love. She is most definitely a war goddess, but of a very particular kind, which distinguishes her from the other figures whom the medieval Irish placed in this category. She not only provokes and revels in war, but gives success in war and in love to favoured people. Her favours are also sometimes strongly amorous and erotic. Sex is one of her interests and pleasures. She is not the wife or the lover of the war god, but of the good god, the Dachta, associated with good living, leadership, and earthly vitality. In this combination of traits, she makes up a group not with other Irish goddesses, but with major figures from other pantheons, the Mesopotamian Inanna and Ishtar, the Syrian Astarte and Anat, the Roman Venus, the Norse Freya, and in a few places the Greek Aphrodite. All were associated with both war and love, or at least sex. This combination, so counterintuitive to late modern sensibilities, may be accounted for in different ways. One is that all the societies concerned were dominated, at least in public life, by men. War and sex were two of the most exciting activities of testosterone-heavy elite males in ancient societies. They may therefore have felt inspired to conjoin them. There could, however, be a deeper reason for the association. Love-making and armed combat are both activities that pair people off, make the blood pump and the adrenaline flow. Both can induce an ecstatic frenzy in which inhibitions and reason are equally lost. Both involve a dramatic conjunction of bodies. Perhaps both were the more easily attributed to the same divine source. It is this conjunction that makes the Morrigan special. The unanswerable question is how she became so. It is unanswerable because we cannot place the stories as a body in a proven chronological order. We can roughly date manuscripts and also by their form of Irish, the texts within them. Almost all the texts cited in this lecture seem to derive from the 9th to the 12th centuries, with one or two possibly a little earlier, and only a couple that are late medieval or early modern. The stories themselves, however, may or may not be significantly older than the earliest extant versions of them. As a result, it is impossible to say whether the distinctive identity of the Morrigan among Irish war goddesses was already present before history, or whether it was developed by medieval writers. Her modern reputation certainly rests on very few stories. If we did not have the cattle raid of Cooley and the Second Battle of Moytura, then probably few people would speak of her today. As it is, we certainly have those stories, and people certainly do speak and write of her as a result. Her modern form is not quite the medieval one. She now generally, as you've seen from all the fancy modern pictures I've added, generally wears black and is associated with crows, and British crows, not Irish, at that, and with ravens. These are characteristics imported from the other war goddesses, especially the Bavav. However, her medieval image was, as said, itself not fixed, and it would be entirely traditional for her modern one to evolve as well. That is how storytelling has always worked. My purpose in this lecture has been twofold. I have attempted to make some reflections upon the nature of medieval Irish mythology and its relation to others. I have also attempted to explain why a figure from the Celtic language literature has gained such traction in the modern Anglophone world, while her associated goddesses have not. I hope to have fulfilled that remit, and in doing so, to have fulfilled that of the O'Donnell series. And as my 50th minute is now clicking into extinction, I need to stop.